Hello, everyone. We will go ahead and get going. Welcome to our final session for day one of the Alere Treasury experience. Again, my name is Jordan Fuger-Burmeister. I'm Alere's marketing manager, and I'll be moderating this session. We'll be ending today's sessions with LIBOR to SOFR conversion. Is your organization prepared? With Alere Treasury Advisory Services lead, Sudeep Sharma. A few quick reminders before we start the session. Attendees have been placed on mute for the duration of the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A portal or in the chat to panelists function. We'll be sure to answer them at the end. We do have two polls in this presentation to gauge where attendees are at in this conversion journey. Please participate, as this allows us to cater the presentation to our crowd today. This session is available for 1 CTP credit for attending the full 55-minute session. There will be a link to the certification exam or assessment, I should say, that'll be sent at the end of the presentation. With that, I will pass it over to Sudeep.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. And thank you, Alere marketing team, for doing such a great job for making this event possible for our discussion today. On behalf of Alere Treasury Advisory Practice team, I want to thank all of our attendees. Hello. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sudeep Sharma. I am the head of the Treasury Advisory Practice here at Alere. I'm a CTP. I have over 20 years of experience in Treasury. My first 16 years were spent in handling corporate Treasury work, and the last 7 years in Treasury system implementations and Treasury Advisory Practice, of course. So just very briefly about my team and what we do. We are a team of experts responsible for working and helping our clients as advisors across industries regarding treasury and liquidity management functions and processes that would involve needed improvements, optimizations, process automation, and system implementation. Let's see here. Let's try to go. Okay, so let's just quickly review what we'll cover today. So here's the agenda, right? So we'll first briefly provide information about my firm. We will then review a few things regarding our topic, LIBOR reform and related milestones regarding transition, how it impacts your business exposure risk, a needed switch to SOFR, and for those of you who are impacted, what you should be mindful of to prepare for the change. And then at the end, we'll do the Q&A. So for those of you who haven't heard of us, maybe this is your first time joining this session. Alere really aims to be your trusted advisor. We have done over 250 Treasury roadmaps and TMS implementations. We are certified partners with Oracle, Kyriba, FIS, and Swift. So trusted partners, partner with all major Treasury platforms. We also work on Treasury on-prem and cloud, and we are here to help. So about our Treasury practice, again, I briefly talked about it, but Alere, about my practice, of course, Alere serves in many different areas of Treasury, right? So I myself run Treasury Advisory Services. We are really here to help with your Treasury processes, setting up your Treasury team for success, as there is much more than just implementing a software, right? So we're there to help you understand your Treasury processes and make those efficient changes based on the need. And on this slide, it's a quick Nascar slide for some of our 250 plus clients. You may recognize some of them there, but we do work across all industries, both private and public sectors. Yeah, so let's do a quick review of overview of what I'm going to discuss today. So The London Interbank Offered Rate, or LIBOR, is a benchmark interest rate, which has been used in a significant number of transactions, over $400 trillion, even about a couple of years ago, and is still built in significantly in Treasury processes and systems. Ladies and gentlemen, the US dollar LIBOR rates are scheduled to entirely vanish by June 30 of 2023. So it's coming up, coming upon us soon, right? The LIBOR, the US dollar LIBOR 1 week and 2 months rates, as part of this phase out process, will no longer be published after December 31st, 2021, or by the end of this year. So essentially, this year is a critical year for that purpose. As a result of LIBOR's planned phase out, the Alternative Reference Rates Committee, or ARC in US, responsible for looking for an alternative rate, has recommended a rate called Secured Overnight Financing Rate, or SOFR, to the market as a benchmark interest rate to replace USD LIBOR for dollar-denominated derivatives and loans. Since LIBOR is substantially built in the plumbing of our financial systems, its discontinuation will have a huge impact on Treasury processes, technology in use and operations. And so at this point, corporate treasurers must, if it has not happened yet already, allocate resources and budget to undertake initiatives to address the changes that are needed to switch from LIBOR to SOFR, as their existing loans and exposures are impacted by this rate conversion event. The changes will have to be made in the way the US dollar LIBOR was used as a reference for processes such as risk assessment, valuations, and accounting. So in summary, we will review today on today's call, first, LIBOR's phase out timeline and its replacement rate SOFR. Number two, LIBOR's uses by Treasury and areas exposed to risk. And then number three, treasurers need to undertake initiatives to convert rates in contracts, processes, and system. Before we get into the details, we will do our first polling question first. So Jordine, over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sudeep. So we do have a quick poll here just to gauge where our crowd is at today. Where are you at in your understanding related to transitioning from LIBOR to SOFR? Do you have expert knowledge? Do you know it well, but maybe you're still curious? Maybe you have little knowledge and have questions that we might be able to answer here for you today, or no knowledge at all. This might be your first exposure and are looking for more information. We've got some good response. We'll give another 10 seconds here. Everyone get their responses in, and then we will share and see where the team is at here. Last chance to get that response in. And we're going to go ahead and close it out. So it looks like for most of our crew on here today, we have little knowledge and still have some questions, or know well, but are still curious. So a good distribution here, Sudeep, for our attendees.
That's very helpful to know really where our audience stands regarding LIBOR transition. So yeah, we definitely will have good conversation covering the background. So thanks for that. Okay, so let's talk about the LIBOR reform next, right? And we will start by focusing on key events related to LIBOR transition. LIBOR, known to be the world's one of the most used benchmark interest rate, is going away. So for a LIBOR basis of around $400 trillion of loans and derivatives, changes have been made and changes will continue to be made. So the question is, why is this change needed? What happened to LIBOR? Essentially, This need to change was felt by the LIBOR's regulator, the UK Financial Conduct, the UK Financial Conduct Authority, hard to say, the FCA, and LIBOR's administrator, ICE Benchmarks Administration, or the IBA, since the 2008 global financial crisis, because they had a few concerns. So they started to notice that the LIBOR could no longer be used effectively. They also perceived LIBOR to be posing a systemic risk due to rate fixing by few bad bankers to their advantage. LIBOR's move opposite to economic events, since it did not reflect costs from actual transactions and a potential threat from a handful of bankers' ability to manipulate $400 trillion market globally, right? Because of all these reasons, in March of 2021, IBA and FCA in UK made it public that LIBOR will no longer be published. So what happened after that? To make sure that the industry or the financial market still had a transition plan for this event that was coming up soon, UK authorities made sure to work with delegates of major banks and impacted country regulators to come up with a plan for a smooth transition. So as an outcome of that workout, few milestone dates were published for each country impacted. Here we have some critical dates to keep in mind in order to plan for things and effectively execute those plans. The reporting of 1 week and 2 month US dollar LIBOR rates will stop after December 31st of 2021, which is end of this year. The remaining US dollar LIBOR rates will cease to exist after June 30, 2023, just so the more heavily used LIBOR tenors, has more time to manage contracts that are more difficult to transition because of that reason. And a very high emphasis by authorities on no use of any US dollar LIBOR rates, so on the new contracts. And it's expected to completely stop at or before the end of 2021. Pretty important industry milestones here. But the concern about market readiness for the transition still remains for us to be LIBOR free. Just to provide a global snapshot here, here's a picture of what the global reform to LIBOR efforts look like. There are actually 5 primary currencies in LIBOR, and each currency jurisdiction is conducting a process similar to what is happening here in this country. Which is, identifying a replacement rate for LIBOR and then planning and executing a transition plan as a way forward. Our focus for today's conversation obviously is going to be US dollar LIBOR, but I still wanted to provide a snapshot of what is going on globally. So as you can see here, each impacted currency has its own rate. So in the US, our working group responsible for finding a replacement for LIBOR is the Alternative Reference Rates Committee, or ARC, and the Secured Overnight Financing Rate, or SOFR, has been recommended as the replacement rate. In the similar manner, UK authorities, for example, have identified SONIA in the UK market as their replacement rate. So effectively, each currency jurisdiction has their own approach, which is different. So for each jurisdiction, the plan is that Sterling will switch to SONIA, Euro will switch to Easter, Swiss franc will switch to CERN, and Japanese yen to TONA. Okay, so let's look at SOFR next. As I mentioned, all US dollar tenors will cease to exist at the end of June 2023. Overnight, 1 week, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, all of them. So in light of what is happening, the US Federal Reserve has recommended banks to start entering into new contracts with the US dollar LIBOR before or by end of this year. The Alternative Reference Rates Committee, or ARG, which was convened by the Fed to oversee the transition process for US dollars, has recommended the Secure Overnight Financing Rate, or SOFR, as the alternative rate. So US dollar LIBOR and the rate reporting officially started back in April of 2018. So ARC came out and started to publish the rate back in April of 2020. So it's officially already has started. But what happened prior to April of 2028, right? I mean, I'm sorry, April of 2018, after we knew that LIBOR was going away. Let me get into a bit of storytelling here, just to give you a background as to why we are discussing SOFR in the US market's case. So again, just to reiterate, LIBOR transition is a big undertaking where about $400 trillion of products worldwide are impacted. And for corporations, the instruments that will be impacted can be something like revolving credit facility or swap or floating rate loan. And our focus will be just US market for today's conversation, of course. So why is this transition needed? Let's review that. And we will talk more about SOFR later. So LIBOR rates fundamentally, more than 30 years ago, when the rate really became popular as interbank lending and the financial industry started to use in many contracts, represented the rate at which banks could borrow from each other, right? In a solid market for decades, LIBOR served as the reference rate for banks to use as funding mechanism. So what has happened since last decade and up through today is that we've seen a significant decline in those interbank lending trades, where there was a huge amount of volume adding contracts to LIBOR a few decades ago. The use of 1 month and 3 month LIBOR rates has been either diminished or has been reduced drastically in a market today. Basel III seems to have been one of the major reasons for the decline, since this international regulatory framework has effectively driven banks to borrow for much longer tenors after 2008 economic crisis to bring financial stability in the market. Because of which the LIBOR market that we use today in loans is essentially underpinned by very little underlying activities. So now basically these major banks who 20 years ago would submit the rates at which they in reality borrowed from each other, they are effectively submitting these rates based on their own expert judgments now. So there's really no underlying transactions there. That's due to lack of activities in short-term LIBOR rates. So what also happened in 2008 and 2009 timeframe during the financial crisis is that LIBOR rates were discovered to be manipulated. So since there was no backing with underlying transactions, it was discovered that certain contributing banks were artificially adjusting LIBOR either high or low to cook the books in their own advantage, which in turn the LIBOR scandal, and at the end of it triggered a concern about the reliability and sustainability of LIBOR rates in the unsecured interbank funding market. Regulators obviously had an eye on this, and as I mentioned before, this was a huge issue when a handful of banks could manipulate $400 trillion worth market or the market of that magnitude. There were, of course, several penalties with billions of dollars of fines imposed on these bad bankers, and then regulators decided to go fix the LIBOR industry. Well, then it was really too late, and none of the applied fixes worked since LIBOR was structurally damaged and recovery was impossible. One of the main reasons that regulators were not able to solve the LIBOR issue is that the fact that the interbank lending market really no longer exists. Now, because LIBOR could not be fixed, the regulators of LIBOR, or the FCA in UK, announced in 2017, I'm getting my years wrong, mixed up, announced in 2017 that the market should migrate away from LIBOR. And since not having LIBOR would have a negative impact on the market, regulators had to take an immediate action to start building an effective transition plan. So effectively, the regulators guided the financial market that we needed to transition before the end of 2021, which is this year, which really led to the birth of SOFR. So effectively, secured overnight market, secure overnight financing rate, or SOFR, is the overnight repo rate, reflects a borrowing for one day, representing secured funding cost for banks pledging US Treasuries. In the US market, the Alternative Reference Rates Committee, or ARC, was convened by the New York Fed and made up of about 50 different entities. ARC is designed to represent the broader US market, like banks and other non-financial institutions, to help make decisions, and was tasked with finding the alternative risk-free rate. ARC ultimately determined SOFR to be the US dollar LIBOR's replacement rate. But when ARC was in the process of evaluating an alternative rate, it also evaluated other rates such as Fed funds rate, T-bills, but landed at SOFR since ARC wanted a rate with a lot of transactions as backing to actually see its changes compared to economic changes historically, and that was possible. So over 800 billion average daily trades in the US Treasury repo market, where entities post US Treasuries as collateral and borrow money, a fully collateralized borrowing and one of the most liquid market in the country. Okay, so that was about SOFR. This is an example of calculating simple interest on this slide, and I have compounding interest on the next slide for a one-week loan. I'm not going to cover all components here. Also, I would encourage everyone to check out the New York Fed's ARC website about this and many other contents regarding transition. A wealth of information is there. So LIBOR versus SOFR, how do they differ, right? Now, we know a bit about history and reviewed SOFR. Let's just review how they compare to each other. And as you can see here, compared to LIBOR, SOFR's ability in calculating from a large pool of underlying transactions makes it more reliable and less likely candidate for manipulation. And I'm sure you're aware of this. LIBOR is called an unsecured rate. It's with no collateral backing, but SOFR is secured, which is a notable difference. LIBOR has 7 different tenors, They are forward-looking, so you may borrow now and you will know your rate right there then. SOFR overnight, however, obviously being an overnight rate is backward-looking. So along with SOFR, the market also wanted a forward-looking term rate similar to LIBOR, but would be with the reforms that we made after the financial crisis. Uh, Focus was more or less objectivity and transparency, of course, because of what happened during 2008, 2009 timeframe. So now there is a good news as a resolution to having term rates available. On July of 29 of this year, ARC formally recommended the forward-looking SOFR term rates developed by the CME group, which is CME is a leading derivatives market operator. So as an important move for transition from US dollar to an alternative risk-free rate, because it offers market participants forward-looking term rates that work similar to LIBOR. So initially, when the SOFR came out, it was just overnight rate. There was no forward-looking term rate. But now, because what CME has done, there is a term rate available, which is a good news, of course, as the market wanted. So while LIBOR used a subjective method, SOFR is, in comparison, uses an objective method with backing with US Treasury repos. Very objective and very transparent. While LIBOR is administered by a private company called ICE, Benchmark Administration, SOFR is administered by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And so New York Fed's website has rates and volume information available there. Regarding volume, SOFR has daily trades of over $800 billion in a daily average compared to LIBOR, which is down to now just $500 million. So is SOFR really better than LIBOR? The answer is a resounding yes. Average SOFR is definitely better. Although an overnight rate can be used as a benchmark, it's seen that the market has been using some type of average to determine the floating rate payments. So the graph on the left is a proof. As seen on this chart, that September 2019, the spike on overnight SOFR hardly had any impact on the 3-month and 6-month average SOFR rates. Just to back the case to use average rate versus using the single days overnight rate to determine a floating rate on payments, and the CME has facilitated that now. There are essentially a couple of reasons as to why the financial market would use an average rate of the versus the overnight rate. First, an average of daily overnight rates will accurately reflect movements in interest rates over a given period of time. And then secondly, an average overnight rate smooths out day-to-day fluctuations in the market rates, making it more appropriate for use. And also with SOFR, you still follow the same loan convention where you make a monthly or quarterly payments. You would also use, for example, 30-day average SOFR to book your monthly accrual. The graph on the right side shows a comparison of 3-month LIBOR to 3-month average SOFR. It shows clearly that actually LIBOR consistently stayed higher just by about 4 basis points over the same period of time, than SOFR. This chart validates that average SOFR offers a cheaper alternative to cost of funding versus LIBOR. So what are we exposed to? Term loans, floating rate notes, interest rate swaps, employee benefit payments, accounting related work, fair value calculations, lease valuations, accruals, and intercompany lending, right? So for all of your contracts and processes that use a LIBOR rate to calculate interest on references for projections, valuations, and accruals, that would also include on-balance sheet and off-balance sheet exposures, risk management models, and also any associated systems used for recording and maintaining contracts and analysis, like TMS or Treasury Management System. The importance of LIBOR as a global index in financial markets across the world has never been questioned. For the last 30 years, LIBOR as a benchmark rate has served as the guiding tool for the global economy. And it has been widely used with trillions of dollars worth contracts still outstanding, a cause for concern since it will cease to exist soon, right? So the 3-month US dollar LIBOR alone has had about $200 trillion worth of debt and contracts associated with it, just an example. So no matter what the exposure, we need to identify them soon so that they can be transitioned to a risk-free rate or SOFR. So now, need for an action. So for, what do we do to prepare for it, right? So as we know, LIBOR as a benchmark interest rate has been built into Treasury processes and systems, and it's not having available definitely will have impact on our Treasury processes, technologies, and operations. So there is definitely a need for an action. Corporate Treasury, you must allocate resources and budget to undertake initiatives to address the changes that are needed to switch from LIBOR to SOFR, right? Changes will have to be made in the way LIBOR was used as a reference rate for processes such as risk valuation and accounting. So a transition from LIBOR to SOFR can be a huge task if you're late in the process. It can be daunting, matter of fact. Working with the counterparty to address those contractual language to find a cheaper rate is very important, since it will impact the funding cost. Having some fallback language, reviewing those contracts, it's pretty important. I'm sure banks are rolling out their own program, but proactively speaking with your contact and in getting them, getting it prepared so that you can start to have that conversation and start revising those contracts. Those are going to be pretty important steps at the beginning for the switch. Now, for planning purposes, documenting your US dollar LIBOR linked exposures is a very first step in developing a LIBOR transition plan in consideration of the facts and circumstances applicable to your own portfolio. So confirming all references and instrument in use that go beyond 2021, including floating rate notes, business loans, derivatives, and securitizations. Then as a next step in the process, depending on the depth of your LIBOR exposure, taking a change management project to address transition for each type of instruments like interest rate, commodities, capital markets, and debt, along with getting all the stakeholders involved, like tax and legal, with documentation of milestone to achieve, considering all the regulatory requirements and best practices is a must. to start preparing for that, right? For the transition. Okay, so the checklist. So in this slide, it's going to be helpful to those of you who have not started on things yet. It's very important here that start to prepare for things by getting stakeholders involved, getting them educated first to, so that you can lay out a solid transition plan. This is an ARC released checklist to help companies transition and prepare for no LIBOR. And what would be involved? What we would start with at the first place would be, making someone in charge, rolling out a project, and so that this person would keep up with current information. And what it boils down to at the end of the day is really assessing your contracts with LIBOR exposure, what contracts you have that are tied to LIBOR, and those contracts, are they robust enough to survive LIBOR succession? What do you mean by that? And having that good fallback language to make sure that in the event where LIBOR disappears, you have a good contracting point or negotiating point that you can discuss. I mean, have that negotiation with the bank, so you're not stuck with something like a prime rate with a higher rate than SOFR, of course, right? Again, what contracts do you have in place? Is it just the LIBOR contracts, or is it LIBOR swap, right? Is it just a loan or swaps, or is LIBOR a default rate in one of your contracts, and does that need to be amended? So really doing your due diligence to explore where your LIBOR exposure is pretty important. So for many of you, it may be just in your contract, right? Just understanding where your exposure sits and being prepared to address what happens upon these changes is the key. Do you have any accounting and reporting issues, or anything that gets triggered if you change your rate? Those are the types of things that you should do your due diligence on, and get an understanding of where you are situated with respect to the end of 2021, the target date, of course. So yeah, I think we are ready to go on the next poll question. Jordan?
I think there's one more slide for the second half of preparedness first. There you go.
Oh yeah, here we go. All right. Yeah, so I was pretty much done with it.
All good. So we have our second poll launched here. So now that Sudeep has gone through our kind of 10 key preparedness items, which items are you most concerned about? And you can select all that applies. You can select multiple. Is it establishing program governance, developing a transition management program, implementing a communication strategy, identifying and validating exposure, developing your product strategy, risk management, assessing contractual remediation impact and designing a plan, developing operational and technology readiness, accounting and reporting, or taxation and regulation? We will give everyone about 30 seconds to answer here. While you're answering the poll, if you do have any questions, I know I've seen a couple come through in the chat to panelists. Make sure to submit them, especially for those who are still learning more about the LIBOR to SOFR transition. We want to make sure to answer any of your questions live. About 10 more seconds. Please get your responses in. And we will go ahead and close it out here. So spread across the board, it looks like accounting and reporting, though, is our top answer, with taxation and regulation following, and then also identifying and validating exposure. Deep, any thoughts there?
That's great. Yeah, it looks like, let me scroll down here. I can't see the whole thing. For a second. Okay, that's not, here we go. Yeah. So accounting and reporting, yeah, that is in line with the concerns that we've heard from our clients, of course. And then identifying and validating those exposures. That's the key. Like I said, yeah, that's the first thing that you would have to do. And then in turn, connecting with your internal control, the internal controls, and also with experts in accounting and reporting as far as any disclosure that is required, materiality, and things like that, that you would have to be mindful of. That's in line with what we've seen, Jordan. So thank you. Okay, do we have any questions that we want to go through now?
Yeah, it looks like there was one that came into the chat. I think it was referring to the slide that you had on the different geographies and what rates they're adopting now in place of LIBOR. So it says, what about BSBY in the US? It seems to have gained a lot of traction lately. There we go.
Oh, okay, so so I think the question is regarding another rate versus SOFR. Is that with that? I think that's what it is.
Correct.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna have to get back on that. Our focus more was okay, what have the authorities done, and what's been picked up as far as the rate goes. But anything else related to any other rates, yeah, we'll have to get back to the audience with an answer.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sudeep. And we did get a question on whether or not the slides would be available. Similar to our other CTP sessions, we will send out a PDF version of the slides that you can take with the assessment. The assessment is going to be available. I'll drop it in the chat right now. As a reminder, for those who haven't joined us for our other sessions, it is an 80% pass rate, but you can take it multiple times. And those scores are usually released a couple hours after the session wraps. It doesn't look like we have any other questions here, so I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items. Please feel free to submit. Yes, we will be emailing the assessment as well later this afternoon here once we wrap up. So a couple key reminders, please join us tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Central for our second day of the Alere Treasury experience. We're going to kick off with payments transformation, keys to unlocking new payment technologies. That session is going to be available for CTP credits as well. And a link to register for that session is going to be available in the chat shortly. Thank you everyone for joining day one of the Alere Treasury experience. Just a quick reminder, if you post on LinkedIn or on Twitter with the hashtag ETE 2021, we're going to be doing some live drawings for gift cards, as well as got some nice Alere Greg Norman quarter zips that we are happy to send out as well. With that, I want to thank Sudeep for his time today and everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and we will see everyone bright and early at 10 a.m. Central.
Great. Thank you, everyone.